Hello, it's March 8th, 2017. I'm Tony Smario. Coming to you from BroSal.org YouTube channel, and this is End Times Trending. What I wanted to talk about today is what strikes me in this most recent revelation through the mainstream media and other media of the Vault 7 of Wikipedia. Aren't we so intrigued that, thank goodness, we have Wikipedia to tell us all the things that are going on behind the scenes that otherwise we wouldn't know about. Now, there's been a lot of alternative media discussion, investigation. I think James Corbett probably over the years emerges as the finest of the independent investigators that brings the issue to light. I think he misses the eschatological view that we try to provide some insight into, but wonderful investigator as far as bringing to light the stories that are out there and the difference between the version that we're given to swallow and what evidence exists and suggests. And it's dawned on me in watching this most recent thing about Vault 7, because people like Corbett will help demonstrate for you that it's really hard to swallow the idea that people like Snowden and WikiLeaks are really authentic whistleblowers rather than planted Big Brother whistleblowers to give the opposition their leads, so that you know where the opposition's going and why. And there's a lot of stuff behind that. I encourage people to investigate. Snowden, for instance, turns up in a hotel room in Hong Kong because, of course, a BBC interviewer can find him, but the National Security Agency couldn't find him. All that kind of stuff's really unbelievable when then you come out with the leaked information that demonstrates these guys are keeping track of everything, every iPhone, every device, everything we say and do, which is why it's so hard to believe that, ISIS is able to operate with such efficiency in disseminating their very radical rule over people, taxing people, diverting oil profits, and not only stealing antiquities, but getting them sold on the black market, converting that into usable funds, and using those funds to fund this war all over the world under the nose of the same CIA that has all these tools. We're told they can track everything. They could be watching me right now through the camera on my laptop. And so what strikes me about all this is that, we don't even know. It's like the moon landings, the moon landings, moonwalk, all appear to be fake. Whether it was or not, what difference does it really make, except it demonstrates, if it was fake, a real ability to deceive, doesn't it? To lead through deception. And when you look at the deception, whether moonwalk or not, that's gone on over at least my lifetime. I go back to Gerald Ford coming in after Nixon. I remember Gerald Ford as a kid. I remember Jimmy Carter being elected and what a big deal that was because he was supposed to be so anti-establishment. And then Ronald Reagan, that was as I started becoming an adult. So I've lived through this whole Reagan revolution of, on the surface, Wall Street taking over the running of the country, obviously, through this lobbying, through the deregulation, through all these channels that they opened up into the public reality, right? Our reality used to be protected by things that we at least had gotten put in place since the last time they screwed everybody in the 20s and broke the country and there was an uprising. And so they had to make certain concessions to the people, or at least make it appear that way, so the people felt so happy to now go back to work for what turns out to be minimum wage. But at least in their time, when you look, because everything's gotten worse, they tell us the story of every generation getting better and richer and richer. But the truth is that's kind of only been on paper when you look at it. Now, who's really gotten richer? Only this very small handful of people. They've turned out to get whatever the intentions were, whatever all the think tanks were producing, just like in our foreign policy. Supposedly, since World War II, we were supposed to be hanging on to world dominance. But now we're at the whim of ISIS, Syria. Russia gets involved, and oh my God, America's just tripping over itself, doesn't know what to do, how to get control of this. Whole world's falling apart, and all we can do is ship more weapons around the world. That's our answer. So it just seems so unlikely coming out of a history of, thinking people. They say the history of enlightenment, and, because it was the Enlightenment thinkers that founded America. And so when you consider how far we've fallen in the way of all of our intention resulting in, a foreign policy in which we admit to be, I've read that article a couple of weeks ago, we're talked about as, incompetent, our incompetent foreign policy, all these things that present America as if these think tanks, this RAND Corporation, and all these think tanks that have been informing U.S. policy, whether foreign policy, economic policy, at the time, they point to all our geniuses, and these think tanks is why we need to make the rules, deregulate in the case of the Reagan era. This is what we got to do to stimulate the economy. And oh boy, it sure did, right? We were also stimulated. We got to buy a bunch of plastic crap to replace all the real long-wearing things that America used to make. We used to make stuff made in China used to mean crap when I was a kid. And so we went and embraced all that crap as the rational advance of society. We were going to use the economy of production instead of actually putting some effort and skill into making a towel rack or anything else that might be made of natural materials and be made to last a good long time or be of some desirable aesthetic value, intrinsic value. You could burn it when it was finished. You could turn it into something else because it was made out of natural material, melt it down because it was made out of metal. No, all that stuff turned into plastic, made in China for the cheapest labor on the planet, on a grand scale that you could organize into factories of thousands, building everything that used to be built by craftsmanship to a degree, now being built in a production line setting as outlined by Henry Ford, mass production, out of this new miracle material, plastic. And so at the time, we all thought it was, wow, look at that, making everything out of plastic. It was efficient and cheap, and weren't we so smart? So either the people behind it, didn't see through it. Some did. You don't hear about them much, but they wrote their books. They wrote their criticisms of the system. 100 years ago, people like Chesterton were one of those people writing their criticisms of capitalism and pointing to its natural conclusion as one like a pyramid scheme that can only go so far before it has to collapse on itself. So, it's not like it's hard to imagine that these corporations and think tanks and real vested interests didn't have the whole story. You go back to the foundations, their inception being centered around, using that money because they had to change the way Americans think. They had to change the course of history. They had to change education and the history books. Go back and look it up. That's what it says. That's what these guys are really doing. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, all these great foundations to do good. The good they were doing was altering the mindset of humanity to what they were considered was good, and they sold it to us through all these ideas of efficiency, progress, humanitarianism, right? But when we look back, what's it resulted in? A very, very small group having tremendous power and ownership over almost everything, and the average person, who we were told all along and still are, is who they're looking after. They're doing everything they can in the best interest of the average person. And yet now that's, becoming it's like this wolf in sheep's clothing, becoming harder and harder to believe. And so I want to lay that background because whether you want to look at it eschatologically, as we do here, as this spirit of Antichrist, whatever that means, this dragon we've been studying, the real idea of the serpent in occult knowledge is knowledge. The knowledge of good and evil is embodied in this idea of the serpent. So the dragon brings knowledge. The dragons in occult worlds, the sign of this sort of great knowledge. And in the world of, say, Judeo-Christian eschatology, it's a sign of subtle deception. The dragon is the one who deceives the whole world and is equated to the one that's called the subtle one, Lucifer. Subtle, not obvious, subtle deception. Like if you ever watched the old movie The Sting, right? You set someone up through subtle deception. You don't just come in with a bald-faced lie that everybody's pointing at while you're doing it and overpower everyone. That's not subtle deception. That might be going on at the same time, but I'm starting to see that all of that's part of the subtle deception. That's why I wanted to kick off this idea of, what's real and what's not real with this march toward World War III, Iran, and Israel and Russia, all three, and China, when you bring China in, but with Iran and Israel and Russia, they're all products of deception, right? Iran, our hands have been in there for 60 years. To think that we've just been all, like you say, Rand Corporation, all the people who've been giving us our foreign policy, Henry Kissinger, Brzezinski, all these guys, that's just all been a blunder, and we haven't been following some sort of real long-term plan that's got to do with some real in-depth study that isn't changing president to president and cabinet to cabinet. Because Rand Corporation, they don't go to a new think tank, do they? Those people stick around. So, Iran has been manipulated from the beginning. I've recently come to know some Iranian people, and they're under the impression, in the same way we seem to know that Wall Street runs our government, they know that the international banks run their mullahs. So I don't know inside Iranian politics and socio-politics enough to know that, but the Iranians that I know seem to understand that. Israel, clearly, as we discuss constantly with this whole Zionism, even the true believing Jew stands against Zionism because it's an obvious deception. Even their whole premise is as a secret police state, the Mossad, is through deception you'll make war. So, and then Russia, clearly the same people who funded Zionism funded the Bolshevik Revolution and the modern expression of Russia in the sense of the last 100 years. And so all of that has to be taken with, so when just seeing that, okay, knowing that the main players coming down the pike, and then China's included in that because same money funded the Cultural Revolution in China. And so coming into our modern day, this media, which we know was started and influenced by, the world of so-called propaganda and what they found out through psychology, all their years of testing people through the Nazis and then bringing that home after World War II, to confirm and to continue to test the theories of people like Freud. And that was put to the test through people like Edward Bernays that could get women to take on the ugly habit of smoking, just as long as they put it in the emotional context of liberating them from the stigmatism of being submissive to male authority. So, to think that those things aren't being applied and that the internet itself, something they provide for free, you can just tell because they don't make the internet something that costs, $100 a month that only the affluent can afford, only they get to play, like a golf course and all these kind of things, professional sports. You don't see poor people getting to enjoy that, except through their television that's always provided for them. But social media, internet, all these things, free. They'll get you a device. Somewhere in the poorest community is a device to watch television and to be hooked up to the internet. So that's your clue. This is how they hypnotize people. So they didn't bring the internet out to let people undermine them. People like Edward Snowden and WikiLeaks, Julian Assange. That's all BS, man. And here's the other thing, since when is it not America's policy to go in there and take out regimes that are really, truly what we're trying to sell through our narrative as dangerous to our way of life? All the way back from, where do you even start? 100 years ago, Smedley Butler's talking about what he was doing in Mexico in 1914 for the oil interests. So how far back do you want to go to what we've done to Central America, to South America, to the Middle East, to the Indochina region? Our hands have been in it long before I was even born. So to think that today we're just bumbling around with foreign policy that's incoherent is really to follow somebody's tune, the Pied Piper's tune. And when you see what they've been doing with that Pied Piper's tune, well, they've been lying to the populace, telling them, oh yeah, we're looking out for your interest. Oh, we'd never go to war except to protect your interest. Oh, we'd never do all these horrible things. But when you look at now, 100 years later, what they've been saying and what they've been doing, it's so clear they've been controlling the media to tell us one thing while they do another. To pretend that that's not happening is to lie to yourself. So with this, Vault 7 and letting us know about all this, for years now, it's been the surveillance state. And I'm just going to tell you, whether that's going on or not, I've been saying for years, doesn't seem to make much. If they're watching me through my computer, boy, that's a big waste of money, isn't it? Do they really have the money? Boy, they're going to space, and they're always researching new developments in science and technology. We're building weapons. We have projects nobody even knows about. Right? How do they afford all this stuff? And they're watching everybody's television screen. They're collecting everybody's emails. Even if computers are analyzing the data, somebody's got to be programming the algorithm into the computer. Somebody's got to be analyzing the data. We're talking hundreds of millions of Americans on phones every day, saying things like terrorism or, what person, how many people does it take to analyze the footage that's coming through the screens of hundreds of millions of televisions? And, it's, to me, that doesn't make any sense, except as a red herring. Gives us all something to talk about. Oh, the talking heads can debate it on the left and right, bring in experts. It breeds fields of inquiry. It breeds fields of study. Scientific money gets lended to find out what the effect of surveillance is. All this kind of stuff. I say it's like nuclear weapons. I don't doubt they have the technology. I just doubt very much they spend the money paying attention to it. Every person in America is doing. And the fact that they make that a big topic of interest, even through the mainstream media, through the great WikiLeaks and these other things, which, can be argued pretty well, have to be Big Brother operated, misinformation systems. There's just no way to think that we wouldn't, if it was hurting the real people that really want to keep these things secret. I mean, this is damaging their ability to run the world after all these years. And they're not gonna, come on, we know it as constant heart attacks and suicides that make, don't even always make front page news, right? Look at, watch all the stuff on the people surrounding the Clintons that have died over the last 10 or 20 years from heart attacks and suicides. Nobody talks about that. It's not important. It wouldn't be so hard, I'll bet, for Julian Assange. When you're the CIA, you don't have enough contacts to send in some bad cake, huh? So I don't buy it. I just don't buy that these people, if they turned up dead a week after their supposed leaks, then I'd pay attention to what they leaked. They leaked it out, and a week later they were dead. That's kind of, what's going on there? But the fact that this remains the source of the world finding out the dirt, that the deep, dark government that's able to, through our movies, we show the sort of, the sort of fantasy capability. But you're telling me, yeah, Snowden, he's beyond them. And Assange, he's beyond him. Sure, he's in Ecuador. You can't, Ecuador is one of the poorest countries in the world. You couldn't buy a bunch of mafia Ecuadorians to get to that guy in Ecuador. It just doesn't make any sense. None of it makes any sense. So I think, Iran, Israel, Russia, China, they're all, puppets that are clearly in the last 100 years people who are funded with an agenda. Iran's maybe the newcomer to that funding, but Zionism, Russia, 100 years old. Mao, you're going back at least 70, 75 years. Iran, 60 years. This is all part of a pretty old plan, the way I see it. The players that come into being today are all these players, Germany included in Europe. And we'll talk about that on a separate issue because, as I say, watch out, Europe. It's all coming into fruition. I think the next couple of years we're going to see some changes worth talking about in Europe. But for now, what I see is all this crap in the media has got even the commentators that we're all trying to get insight from, even people like me, talking about issues that aren't even real. These things like the surveillance capabilities. If that's not the most planted red herring story to keep our eyes off of the fact that we've been in Afghanistan for 15 years, what the heck do we have to keep, why can't these people run their life the way they want? What is it our business? What evidence can we point to that would possibly sustain, really justify the sustaining of our money and troops there, since we just sent, almost doubled the troops in the last, officially. That we got no business to be in these people's countries. That's just absurd. It's absolutely absurd. Whether they got problems or not, we got problems. How come we're not fixing our problems? Well, their problems don't bear that heavily on us. This pretend war on terrorism is all fake. Nobody talks about that. So I say that's the reason they keep Americans busy with LGBT and this vaults, WikiLeaks and the surveillance state. because A, they don't have the money to surveil everybody, nor the desire. They've already got people, they're willing puppets. They've had America, taking on credit, going to jail. I mean, the only two things America really does great in the world is we produce weapons, the biggest, most advanced weapons, and we're the number one producer and seller of them by far in the world. And the other thing we do is produce prisons. We're the number one producer of prisons and people to go in them in the world. That's what's, think about it. This is what they do in America. So all these wars must be part of that. I mean, drug war keeps people going to prison, and, hostile, violent wars between, clashing of ideals and governments and is all part of that classic Rothschilds loaning to governments to keep them fighting so that you own their, you own their assets, you own them. You own their decision-making process because they have to borrow from you to stay in the game. That's what makes sense. And so we run that whole game. And so, of course, we produce the weapons because that's what everybody has to have. And we produce the prisons because that's what keeps our ability to facilitate, to alleviate. It's like those waters that rise over there at that Oroville Dam, and they finally get so high they spill over, and that spillover is dangerous, the erosion that it can cause. And so it's dangerous to have the people in the lower stratus of your economic reality, especially when you're keeping the majority of people broke and funneling all the resources and all the wealth up to the very top. Of course, you're going to wind up then with this giant pyramid of a structure that supports it underneath that has to, keep climbing over each other to keep from being on the very bottom. And then what do you do with those people on the very bottom? They could be a dangerous source of spillover when that pyramid gets very great. So you create a prison system to contain them and keep sending them into cages, which you then charge that middle public to pay for, and scare the hell out of them to keep them out of the cages. So they keep fighting with each other to stay off that lower rung where you see the cages being filled from. So if all that isn't on purpose, it sure is a wacky accident considering all the great minds that we produce, the geniuses and the think tanks that we produce to go to bat for us, to give us our institutions and our plans, our procedures, our application of our best ideas, how to get at it, how to protect the people, how to give the people the benefit of all of this great country's freedom. So when you just look at the history, it hasn't happened. That's not what's happened. What's happened is what's so transparently clear that even the mainstream media, it comes out now, which I say is all part of the sign of getting very close to this apocalyptic transition, because they're going to use the fact that everybody's being made aware, coming aware, or a great growing minority keeps becoming aware of the depth and reality of the control, the manipulation, and the deception. And so I say that you got to realize it's all such a deep deception that most of what the media would talk about as the big issues would have to be, by default, not the big issues. The big issues then would be things that are framed to be seen in the way they need them seen. And everything else would then be the smoke and mirror issues to distract from having to give too much consideration to the big issues so that you truly discuss the issue thoroughly. And I say that's why this whole things like the surveillance state and the nuclear threat and North Korea and ISIS and Islamic terror and, all these things, these topics aren't even real. They're wag the dog real. They're as real as they need to be to convince everybody that They're the issues of the day. But of course, if any one of those had any actual reality, they could be dealt with by these genius think tanks that we have. They have been dealt with even by the amateur genius on the side for the last 100 years to write the books and tell us the variation of what we say we're trying to do and what we're doing, and try to offer the correction. That's always gone on, because the lie has always been there. People say, oh, we're doing it for the good of the people and we're doing this. And so then you got that voice that sees through it and says, well, wait a minute, it's not really good for the people then that you deregulate everything and put the big banks in charge. That's not so good for the people. So you have that voice. So that voice is always anticipated, and it has to be shut down, which means before you even announce the deregulation, you've taken into anticipation the voice that would be raised against it, and you've got a plan for how to deal with that blowback. And so I say when you just look at the issues we're faced with today, they've got this whole list of issues that really aren't real at all. From North Korea, which doesn't make any sense. This idea, as I say, that these heads of state, we get shown this Kim Jong-un as if the whole, millions of North Koreans are just in unison with whatever we're presenting as this absurd, maniacal leading of, as if all he does, all their country, all the millions of them do, is think about, how to launch a missile at the United States. And if that were true, don't you think that would have been part of our intelligence discussion for the last 10 or 20 years? Like the way we pretend with the Iran idea of their nuclear program. That's got to be such a big deal, because it really isn't. But the nuclear program of North Korea, which I've never heard about until this past year, is suddenly they're threatening war with South Korea. They're threatening war with Japan. They're threatening to launch missiles at the United States. And we keep reporting it just like we do the Orlando massacre. Nobody bothers to point the holes in the fact that, who is this guy and why aren't we getting any, what does he do all day? Really? What have they been doing for 20 years? How come, if that's all he does, how come we haven't heard anything about it until now? And if he's a true threat, how come our SEAL teams haven't been in there to take him out? Or how come we haven't started a color revolution before now like we do in all these Middle Eastern or South American countries to help stir up the people and get somebody else in power that's more favorable to what we want? That's, we can't get into North Korea. We were there in the 50s, weren't we? So when did we lose grip? And if we did, why isn't that part of the journalism? Geez, we had in the 50s, we were in there. And here's what we did. And here's how we exacted our influence in the 50s, which was quite strong coming after winning World War II. Not many people in the world were resisting our influence in the 50s. So we were in Korea in the 50s. How'd we screw it up so bad? I'd like to hear the story of how we messed it up so bad that an entire country is really a threat to all their neighbors now, nuclear threat, and we can't authorize a strike. ISIS isn't a nuclear threat. We're dropping thousands of bombs on innocent people over there, causing all of this destruction of a culture and this refugee problem that's threatening the world. How come we're not dropping some bombs on North Korea? If they're, it doesn't make any sense except as a pure distraction, because we're in charge in North Korea and they're doing just what they're told as part of the script right now. And notice they show about 4 or 5 different stock photos of North Korea, even though they've been said to be testing bombs now on and on and on, and they're preparing for war and all. They never show you Kim Jong-un talking to his people today like you can see Hitler in the rallies, rallying the people up for hostilities. How come they don't show us pictures with a translator translating what Kim Jong-un is saying as he's addressing the people who are there by the 100,000 ready to go to war with America? Why do we present it that way? I say because it's not really real. We keep showing a few stock footage of a missile going off. We don't even know where or when, and keep presenting it as they're preparing for wars. If the whole North Korean country is behind this guy, show me that. Show me why I'm worried, because millions of North Koreans are just chomping at the bit to start a war with somebody, knowing, of course, they'd be annihilated like Iraq was when they started a war with Kuwait. So show me that. Show me the willingness of the North Koreans. The nuclear threat. Oh, we've been hearing about it my whole life, and it sounds more and more like the surveillance state. It's just something you can't prove. It's something that sounds really expensive. It's something that sounds like they never allowed anybody to build many nuclear. It sounds like they control a very small cadre of nuclear weapons that exist around the world. And the places that make them probably do exist all over the world. And there's probably a few of them that exist, and it's probably under absolute central control all over the world, and it's used to be talked about, just like the CIA and intelligence technology. You think they really do let other people have it? Or do they go kill anyone else that might have it? That's what I think that's what I'd do if I had it. I wouldn't let anybody else threaten me once I had control. So I think the nuclear threat, and that's how they're going to use it to make friends with Russia now. That's why Trump came in. We're going to strengthen our nuclear thing. We're going to talk to Russia, and we're making it nuclear war. They talk too much about it for it to be real. They don't talk about neutron bombs much. They don't talk about their ability to blow up bombs that shut off all the electricity. They don't talk about all the, what have they been working on since the atomic bomb? They got patents for stuff. They can make earthquakes, right? Are they why don't we talk about where would we make an earthquake in a military situation? Since we know we can and have a patent to do it, where are we, if nothing's off the table and weather warfare has been talked about for 50 years, how come we don't talk about the weather warfare that's on the table, right? Because that's not to be talked about. Oh, nuclear? Oh, yeah. That's old hat. Nuclear weapons, nuclear. Everybody gets to talk about nuclear weapons. Probably because nobody's really got any, is what I think. Or the control of them is so tight that nobody's afraid of the stuff that they talk about constantly. ISIS, Islamic terror, surveillance state. All these heads of state as if Obama's doing this and Trump is doing that and North Korea and China. They all just act as one. They're all of one accord all the time. They don't have any parties in their country. They don't have any political discussion. They don't have any intelligentsia. They don't have a class and a whole movement in their culture that is disseminating their own ideas of their future. No, just China is doing this. North Korea is doing that. That's how we speak. And then when we speak at home, we speak of Obama and Trump, as if they go home and make the decision. Trump and Melania sit around and decide, I'm getting tired of North Korea. Here's what I'm going to do. And the press continues to fuel that. That's how you know it's not real. Climate change is not real. The fact that the climate's always changing is real, but human-induced CO2-inspired climate change has been demonstrated to be a fallacy. It's demonstrated to be a political tool. It's demonstrated to be using the reality to manipulate people through a complete lie. And yet, it's another one of those things like North Korea, like Wikipedia, like it's a staple slogan in the modern world of hypnotic thinking. climate change, right? Climate change. We all have to know about climate change. No one talks about the real science of this, polar minimums and these cycles, the ice ages that apparently the science was already pointing to 50, 60 years ago, because they were talking about a return to an ice age. And so it seems in our modern world of doublespeak that because that's true, they turn that into climate change, and the world's getting warmer and everything, the seas are rising. And I'm sorry, but all that popular stuff has to be lies based on the structure of our modern reality, in my view. Russian aggression, Iranian aggression. The people that have no money or weapons in order to be aggressive. Russia, like I said, they were broke 20 years ago. What do they got the business being aggressive against a country that broke them? We could have taken Russia over 20 years ago. So a lot of people said we did. The corporations did. So the fact was they were taken over 100 years ago through the Bolshevik Revolution, and the money that invested there cannot be demonstrated to have ceased. So Russian aggression is a promoted thing to keep the Hegelian dialectic, so-called, energized as the motivating tool, the lever that keeps us all moving toward a particular end, which has got to be a war, because you wouldn't build all these weapons the last 60, 70 years if you weren't intending to kill a bunch of people with them. And war, through the think tanks, is demonstrated to be one of the most effective ways of wiping out mass populations, of adjusting, of resetting populations. Big wars are proven to be, through the think tanks, one of the unavoidably beneficial things to humanity. Now, what's real? What's going on that's real that's going to lead to this war? Okay? China's got a lot of people and a lot of influence. That whole area over there that extends from Afghan all the way through China and to Hong Kong, which is why the British had to have Hong Kong. That's an important port. It's an important place over there. So the fact that China has to be brought into the New World Order is an important aspect of what's going on with this whole sudden change. Not really sudden when you consider the sudden change was that all of our things that were produced in America, we decided to destroy, or whoever they are, this circle of people who have a plan, decided to destroy the economy of the United States and this middle class they'd been creating, to send all of the work over to China in order to bring China up and drop America down. That was obviously done on purpose. And so you have to understand that China is a major player in this new world. And I say part of it is that, their billion people or whatever have to be brought into a war to reduce that number. And yet, I think, like South America and Central America, especially South America, many are going to be kept because they're proven manufacturers. I mean, why wouldn't you're going to have to manufacture in the future, aren't you? So I don't think the war is going to be in China. Chinese people are going to have to go fight in other places, but I think they'll probably preserve a lot of their infrastructure that they've spent the last 50, 60 years building to do manufacturing. Just like I think they'll preserve a lot of the infrastructure that they built in South America to grow food. That's why those are probably safer places when you look at it in that bigger picture. The Sunni-Shia war is real. That's been, I think they have that plan all the way back from the British Empire and the introduction of Wahhabism through Saudi Arabia. So, that's real. Afghanistan and the reality of what Afghanistan represents is what, I forget the name of the author 100 years ago, wrote as the heartland of the world. That Brzezinski comes along in the grand chessboard and points out that our influence there either has to grow or our influence there will be in relation to our future as a dominant power, and 4 years later 9/11, and we're at war in Afghanistan in the longest war in U.S. history, occupation, it should be. It's not really. What could those people be offering as a resistance to the modern forces of the United States, except that we only send enough in there to continue the war so we can continue to occupy what has been identified for 100 years now as the heartland of the world. That's where the mineral resources of the future, gas resources, the poppy fields, all these sort of resources of the future exist over there. Whose hands are they going to fall into? So anyway, that's why the war with Afghanistan is very real. We have to destroy those people and take what is theirs. The Palestinian oppression, obviously real. What it's been producing on, I think, quite a measured scale since 48. It has always been orchestrated through Iran to supply the weapons through the resistance, Hamas and Hezbollah, to keep a constant pressure point there so that could then be exacerbated when the time came to, meanwhile, you've built up all this terrorism, blaming it on the Arabs when it's really the Christian Zionists that are behind all the terrorism. So that, the poor Palestinians dealing with that oppression, that's real over there. That's a real pressure point that exists. The orchestrated chaos for people right now is real. We're building into it all the pressure points, bringing up all the arguments, showing the deceit and the manipulation and the evil behind our government. Everything from the pedophilia. The top movie a couple of years ago was Spotlight, showing you how the Catholics have been institutionalizing pedophilia all these years and nobody's done anything about it. And now they're showing you the government doing it, and they're revealing through WikiLeaks and stuff how it really works. And that just helps build in the base of the chaos against the other side, who are willing to keep being hypnotized by the status quo and the mainstream media, playing, the Pied Piper that keeps you all following that tune, regardless of what the rational evidence suggests. But they're presenting all the rational evidence nonetheless, because a certain portion, 10%, 20%, will come to regard that evidence and become a resistance. And, now you have chaos, which we see today. The plans for war, obviously real. People who don't understand that nobody's trying to resist war, they're setting up for war. But that also makes what I think the most important things that are real coming in the near future are some sort of peace agreement before the Great War. There might be more of these wars and rumors of wars. There might be some more false flags. There might be some more real incidents. I say over there in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, they don't mind killing those people because that's what's meant, that's where the war is being stimulated. It's Arabs and Zionists that are meant to be part of the first annihilation. But before the Great War can come, they're going to strike a peace deal that allows the rebuilding of the temple. That's what's going to come out of the fall of ISIS, I believe. Not immediately, but after what fills the vacuum of the Sunni world is a good caliph. The good caliph, which, the Turkey right now, Erdogan, is trying to become. Saudi believes that they are they've been set up to be proclaimed as the righteous, the obvious leader and king. However, the schism and the Saudis being known as nothing like a decent religious leader leaves only one other option, and that's the good Hashemite king. Remember, Baghdadi is claiming to be a Hashemite leader, the Hashemite king descended from Muhammad. So there's a certain instance where they need to make right on that. And anyway, that leaves the Hashemite king in place to be the one that stands up for Islam, stands up for the Sunnis, tries to make some sort of peace with their Shia brothers to avoid that war, make peace with the Christians and the Jews and rebuild the temple and get us on this road to the eventual division between real Christianity and real Islam and the Dajjal and the false Messiah that's going to come along in the temple that they built. So that all has to be preceded by a peace deal, which is why all this war talk is all like the surveillance state. It's garbage. Iran, Israel, Russia, China are all controlled by the same people that control England and the United States. So World War III will come on plan, but it won't be until peace and safety are declared. And so we got some stuff to watch and a ways to go. So hope you keep watching with us. Appreciate you being here. Talk to you soon. See you soon.